the disability rights movement in the UK developed in the 1970s. Yes, disabled people were better educated than ever before, but we're living in segregation. So we're living largely in young, as they say, disabled adults were living in residential homes, and they wanted access to the mainstream. And so you got the formation of all of these different disability groups, and there were many of them. So the most successful of them was called Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation. And you can hear in the voice, you know, UPIAS, very much militant, self-organized, and saying, hang on a minute, there are all of these blooming disability charities, but they don't speak with us or for us. And what we need is a sort of consumer voice of disabled people. And they were a sort of Marxist-Leninist group. And like all Leninist groups, they talked internally, came up with a line, and then said, this is our line. If you don't like it, we'll expel you. So, I mean, you know, I don't agree with that approach, but that's what they did. And the line they came up with, as you now know, is called the social model of disability. And this came with the work of people like Vic Finkelstein and Paul Hunt, and basically stated that disability is imposed on people with impairments. And disability is the way society treats people with impairments. It's the barriers, it's the lack of access, and so forth. And that's what we must change. And so that led to British Council of Organisations for Disabled People. It led to Disabled People's International on a global scale. And so from 1981 onwards, there's this very vigorous global and indeed UK movement of self-organized groups. And that's important because they set themselves in opposition to the charities that had hitherto dominated the disability sector. They said, you know, having had a disability was essential to talking about it. And again, you know, the campaigning against the barriers. And one of the questions I've had about it for many, many years is who is included and who is not included. The group, UPIAS, were predominantly people with spinal cord injury, polio, and other physical impairments, almost all of them. And they were a bit macho, as you can tell from the way they operated, but they were not really, they had a few people with visual impairment, but they weren't, I mean, I think disability is a lot of things. Well, they think disability is a lot of things, but I think we need to take that seriously. And so it's easier to include people with visual impairment, hearing loss, and physical impairment. But then when we start thinking about people with intellectual disability, learning disability, or people with mental health conditions, that's really hard. Not hard, not impossible, but it needs some modification. And now we're talking about people with dementia. You know, we should have been talking about them from the start, but now we're talking about people with dementia. So I believe that the approach, the disability rights approach, should be open to everybody with what I see as a disability. The original formulation may have got things a bit wrong, but can we take some stuff from it that would be useful in our work? And in my academic work, one of the things I said the social model got wrong is that it's making this distinction between impairment or illness and disability. Disability are the barriers, the stigma, the lack of access, the employment discrimination, etc., etc. And this is what we must change. And we're not going to talk about impairment. And I think that's a big mistake, because I think if you talk to anybody with disability, they will say, my problems are both. That we are treated badly, that we are excluded, that we do face not a level playing field. There are all sorts of social problems, but also I have an impairment which causes me some difficulty. And that is part of my life, and I talk about it, and getting healthcare for it, getting rehabilitation, getting some medical intervention is important, maybe life-changing for me. So we need to work on both. I think this is political because it's about access to health. It's about access to wheelchairs or to iPads or whatever else you need to deal with your impairment. It is barriers, but it's also this. So those are the two challenges that I would make to the disability rights tradition. One is, let's include all of the disabled people. And the other is, let's accept that the impairment is that nobody wants, with respect, nobody wants to be diagnosed with dementia. I have a spinal cord injury. I have achondroplasia, which is restricted growth. And 10 years ago, I got a spinal cord injury. I can tell you, it's no fun having a spinal cord injury. Certainly, it limits you in all sorts of ways. I get a lot of pain and difficulty. I get bladder infections, all sorts of problems. I don't want them. And if you gave me the choice, I would take that away. And in my work, I've talked about predicament. And I like the word predicament because it's not really negative. It's kind of like, it's a difficulty, but you face it. Life is full of predicaments. And I think the impairment is, that it is healthy psychologically, but it's also realistic empirically to talk about a predicament that you wouldn't want, but it doesn't ruin your life. I mean, some impairments are quite clearly tragedies, but mostly it's a predicament. If we think about dementia, what from my world of disability rights is relevant? And I think clearly one thing that is relevant is this social discrimination. A lot of the things that I believe that people with dementia face are social. The impairment itself is a problem. We don't want to have it. We want to have a medical cure. We want to have some medical help if we can. But right now, people are living with it, that what we can try and do is remove some of those disabilities, some of those disabling factors, as well as campaign for a cure and for better medical research. I completely agree with that. And so in my world, from somebody in a wheelchair, I want access, I want inclusion, I want respect, I want to be treated as somebody with something to say, I want to follow the principle of nothing about us without us. Really important in the disability world, because so much was done to people or for people, but not with people or by people. And so to change that in whatever way we can is really important. So I think there are all sorts of cognitive aids. And I would say that providing those cognitive aids is removing barriers. We can think of that in a disability rights approach. The other phrase from the disability rights world, which is really important, is reasonable adjustment or reasonable accommodation. And I think that's really helpful, because what you're saying is we can't change the world completely to make it possible for disabled people not to be excluded. But we can do whatever is reasonable to adjust or to accommodate what we have in the world to the needs of different people. What would reasonable accommodation look like for people with dementia? We have the yellow card saying, my turn to speak. I need to speak now, or else I'll forget what I've got to say. Well, that's reasonable accommodation. And we could have that in all our meetings. And if we did, people with dementia might be able to participate more. The Raku phone, which is developed in Japan, which only has sort of basically the basic keys, so you can't get confused by it. So there are all sorts of reasonable accommodations that we can make. And I'm interested in what reasonable accommodations we can make to enable people with dementia to be in the workforce longer, to be contributing more, to participate more. The fact that it's invisible does not mean that it's not a disability. There are loads of invisible. I've talked about nothing about us without us. I've talked about barrier removal and reasonable accommodation. But these come from, well, they predate, but they were reinforced by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, but came into force in 2008. It was passed by the UN General Assembly in December 2006, and it's ratified by, I think, 180 countries. And there are 194 countries in the world, so that's pretty damn good. And I think it's the framework for considering disability. I don't think the convention is perfect, but it is the framework. And I think that it should be something that all people with dementia and their supporters look to as a potential support. Because things like access, things like attitude change, things like living independently in the community, things like access to education and to work and to all the rest of it are there. And particularly Article 12, which is about legal capacity and the right to be considered. So the convention is really powerful. In a way, disability is so stigmatized. It's, oh God, people don't want to have a disability. Half of all people who have got a disability, according to the Equality Act, don't identify as disabled. So there's a sort of objective sense, are you disabled? And a subjective sense, do you feel disabled? And people don't want to identify if they've got mental illness, if they're deaf or whatever. But I think that's partly because they think of disability as terrible tragedy nobody would want to have, rather than, remember what I was saying, the disability and also the way you're treated. And that's what we want to change. And there's nothing wrong with having a disability. We all have them. We're all going to get them. They're part of life. As I say, there's a predicament. So if we could see it in this way, a predicament, but really we want to change the barriers, I think more people might identify, and I'd welcome that. I don't want people with dementia or people with disability to go off into a separate, segregated, enclave, a little huddle, because most of us spend our life with non-disabled people, and it's the same for people with dementia. We want people to be included and to be in families and communities and have partners and live in the mainstream. We need both, not a ghetto, but that available for people when they need it. Under the Equality Act, under the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, objectively, people with dementia are counted. They're there whether they like it or not. And therefore, why don't we turn this to our advantage? And it doesn't mean that you have to march under a particular banner, but it does mean, and I'm sure you're already doing this, being able to quote the Equality Act, being able to quote the Convention, and thinking about what can we take, what do we have to adapt from the disability rights movement. It won't all be straightforwardly helpful, any more than it is for people with intellectual disability or people with mental health conditions, deaf people. Deaf people hate the idea that they might have an impairment. As far as they're concerned, they're a cultural minority who want everybody to be able to converse with them in sign language or whatever it might be. They're the same arguments, the same battles that we're all facing. And we use our laws when we can. It speaks to what I know best, which is the disability rights movement. And our organizations and our campaigns and our articles, writing or whatever, has to include people with dementia. And if it fails to do so, if it's not relevant to people with dementia, we have failed. We are saying we're inclusive and we're not being inclusive. And I think that's my message to the disability rights movement, to the disability studies academic research, must be open to this. In our world, co-production, let's say research with, not research on, is really, really important. And we say that about intellectual disability, mental health conditions, deafness, blindness, or rest of it. Well, we should say it about dementia as well. And we should do research with, not on. Saying dementia is a disability does not mean that we're retreating to this medical idea of brains being impaired and walls and tangles or whatever it might be. Yes, that's part of it. I'm not pretending it's not part of it, but I want to go with the removing barriers. That's really interesting. It's intellectually interesting. How can we make this world more accessible to people with dementia? What do we have to do to enable them to participate, to remove the barriers? We talk about dementia friendly and all the rest of it, but I think that's all good. But I also think that people with dementia have human rights. They are human beings. We all are deeply committed to the idea that people with dementia are human beings like everybody else. They have everything that they need in order to be counted as human beings. And if that is the case, which we all agree, where the blooming hell are the human rights? Because human beings have human rights. And I think that's a challenge. It's a challenge to all of us here. It's a challenge to all of our organizations and our research. What would it mean fully to respect and include people with dementia as people with human rights? And that's our challenge. Dementia is not going to go away. We're all going to get older. There'll be more of it. So what does it mean to include people with dementia as human rights? There was a study by the Department of Work and Pensions, which found that 50% of people who were quite clearly disabled didn't identify as such. And that's before we even started thinking about people with dementia. And because it seems so negative to say, and so a lot of people don't want to identify as disabled because it seems to be so stigmatizing, so negative, and all of their life is about what I can do or how I can participate, and I'm not going to be defeated by this thing, and I'm going to overcome it, and all the rest of it. And I wonder whether phrases like disabling barriers are helpful, or rights under the Equality Act, maybe just strategically use the identification. I'm not here to tell people how to identify, but to say, look, this is the benefit of the Equality Act. This is the benefit of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act. According to them, our population is disabled. Let's get on with removing. What about the barriers? What about reasonable accommodation? All of these phrases, most of which don't include the word disability, are useful. Human rights of people with dementia, all of it, you can borrow all of our stuff. None of us want to be disabled, but it is a paradox. I wrote a paper about it because I think, at the one hand, we want to say the lives of people with disabilities are really good, and we know that, and that includes people with dementia. On the other hand, we want to say disability is a real negative, and it is. I mean, spinal cord injury is a negative, dementia is a negative. So how can the lives of people with this bad thing be good? And it is a sort of paradox that on the one hand we say, yay, us, yay, we can do things. And the other hand, we hate this, take this away. But we're good. Well, how can you be? It's illogical, but it is how it is, I'm afraid, for most people. And for me, we can talk theory and we can talk ideology or whatever else. But what persuades me that I'm afraid I'm right. I've been listening to hundreds of disabled people over the last 30 years, and all of them say this. It's without that it's partly a pain, having an impairment, but they're proud and they're going to resist the barriers. That is so common. So I suppose I'm thinking about strategic identification as disabled when you have to, but using some of those tools that we've developed that are there for you and might or might not be useful. You've already got a terrible, terrible disease. You don't want the burden of additional problems. And so I think for your person who has, really terrible onset of dementia, there's still things that could make her life easier. I honestly do believe it is liberating for people twofold. The disability thing is liberating twofold. One, it's liberating because you realize how many of your problems are external to you. That is liberating. Suddenly realizing that the way you're treated, the way society is made up, that's the problem for a lot of it. So that is liberating. But I think the second way it's liberating is just sort of embracing the failure. And it suddenly makes you think, gosh, it's okay to be me. It's okay to have my head down. It's okay to forget things. In fact, it's normal. Most people do. And I think that it's kind of like, yep, hands up, that's who I am. It's okay. I am still okay. I can still help you. It's a really important position for anybody to be in. And it must be particularly important for people with dementia to say, yep, I'm going to forget things, remind me, and I'm going to put it on to you. It's your job to remind me. If I don't do it, I won't do it. You remind me, and then we will do it. So many people who don't themselves have disability are part of the disability world. The family is disabled, not the individual. And I think that's a really important thing in dementia. I'm sure it is. Very few people are totally isolated, thankfully. We're not campaigning for the right to be like everybody else. We're campaigning for everybody else to be inclusive, which means being different themselves so that we can live better lives with them. And so on the one hand, we have to be very real that this is something we want to deal with medically in future. We want to get to a position where it's not debilitating. On the other hand, we've got to say, but people with it, are worthy, they're human rights, they need to be supported, and we can remove barriers to include them. I mean, it is a complicated message, but I think it's much better to say that than just to say, it's terrible, we must stop this at all costs, we must prevent it, and you must be frightened of it. Can I just say something about hope? You could hope for a cure. And for many, many years, we've been told to hope for a cure. But I think there's something different. And Gabriel Marcel, he talks about absolute hope rather than hope for something specific. And absolute hope is about maintaining a sense of self, sometimes called living till you die. It means waiting patiently and actively, not fixating on the inevitable end, but being open to new experiences. And it's about hope in someone, having a communal aspect to life. That's what Gabriel Marcel said. So it's the distinction between hopefulness rather than a false hope. And I don't think we should be in the business of giving people with dementia or carers or anybody else false hope. But I think this idea of absolute hope, i.e. filling your life with good things, with networks, a sense of self, is really important and will help lots of people, both carers and people with dementia, that their lives are worth something and that together we can do things better and differently.